Good morning, everyone. And Vince, don't go anywhere because you're dealing with a man who lives largely in the early 20th century. So I like paper. But we're not here to talk about paper. We're here to talk about how we can enhance paper with some really exciting new tools. I'm very, very fortunate in that for much of the last 30 years, I've been fortunate to be the curator of the original 1903 Wright Flyer. And as a young curator, or maybe I'll say as a beginning curator, because I don't want to think of myself as an old curator now. But as a beginning curator in 1984, I had an extraordinary opportunity. I was able to participate in a project where we dismantled entirely the Wright Flyer, studied it in great detail, did conservation work on it, and reassembled it. And the last time that had been done was in the late 1920s by someone named Orville Wright. So as a beginning curator with my colleagues, for the first time we were literally able to unpack the Wright Flyer as it had been given to us by the hand of its maker. So that was a pretty extraordinary thing. So I've spent a lot of time with this object and looking at it in many, many ways through looking at the actual artifact, but through photography, X-ray photography of certain components of it, understanding it in various ways, and really being essentially consumed by this piece of material culture. But now we have yet another way to accomplish those goals. So I want to say a few words this morning about why we selected the Wright Flyer for this project, and a little bit of the evolution of its display and interpretation here at the Smithsonian, and what its involvement with the Smithsonian X 3D project will allow us to do in the future in exciting and useful ways. The Wright Flyer is what I like to call a signature Smithsonian object, an object that's powerfully associated with the Smithsonian, like the Star-Spangled Banner or the Hope Diamond. And these objects are synonymous with what the Smithsonian is in the national consciousness. When people think of these objects, they think of the Smithsonian and vice versa. These are objects that represent the Smithsonian, what Smithsonian collections are all about, namely milestone historical artifacts, objects you can see nowhere else in the world, objects of national significance that help us define the human species and illustrate what it has and can accomplish. Objects that reflect changing American culture over the course of our nation's history. These signature objects, these signature Smithsonian objects, are also powerful because they bring visitors to the Smithsonian and provide them with an opportunity to see the many thousands of other amazing objects that they may not be aware of before they came. So these signature objects really are not only powerful in their own right, but they really provide a great entryway into the rest of the amazing collections that we have. And the Wright Flyer, I think, is certainly one of these signature Smithsonian artifacts. The Wright Flyer is also a seminal object. By this I mean it's an object that singularly changed the world, and one from which much directly emanated. The Wright Flyer is, of course, famous for being the first piloted, powered flying machine to successfully leave the ground and sustain itself in controlled flight. Simply put, it is the world's first airplane. But this assemblage of wood, fabric, and wire that lifted off the beach at Kitty Hawk on that momentous day in December of 1903 is not significant only because it made the first flight. Even more important, it's a significant object because it embodies all the fundamental design principles of every airplane that followed. Every airplane since, including the ones that you fly on today, stem from the basic Wright design that the Wrights inaugurated the aerial age almost more than a century ago. Every airplane can trace its origins back to the original Wright Flyer. The Wright Flyer is truly a seminal object in that way. So given the historical importance and the iconographic power of the Wright Flyer, it was an obvious choice for the National Air and Space Museum to participate in the Smithsonian X 3D project. Now, the Smithsonian acquired the Wright Flyer in 1948, and it was installed in the Arts and Industries building with an elaborate ceremony on December 17th of that year, 45 years to the day after it made its historic flights. The current NASA building, of course, wasn't around at that time. It opened in 1976. The most cogent and eloquent statement of significance of the Wright Flyer ever, in my view, was uttered at that ceremony in 1948. The airplane had been on loan to the Science Museum in London by Orville Wright for the preceding 20 years. And it was bequeathed to the Smithsonian in his will, and when he passed away in 1948, the airplane came back to Washington and was brought to the Smithsonian. As such, the British ambassador in Washington at that time, a man called Oliver Franks, was on hand for the ceremony. And he said of the Wright Flyer, quote, "It's a little as if we have before us the original wheel." I just love that statement. I've been studying this object for 30 years and written 3 books about it, and he said something more powerful in one sentence than I've been able to do in all the work that I've done on the airplane. But it really is an object that changed the world, and I think to a degree rivaling the wheel. So we clearly, have an object here that is truly a seminal and world-changing object. Since that day in 1948, the Smithsonian visitors have come to see the Wright Flyer hanging on display, first in the Arts and Industries building, and then since 1976 in the current NASA building. But interestingly, even though the Flyer has been a must-see object at the Smithsonian and has become an icon of our collection, up until fairly recently, we have said little about it in our display. People have come, viewed the airplane, many have moved and inspired by the experience, but they've learned very little about the airplane and very little about why it's so significant, how it was created, why it's so important, what does it mean, and the basic question, of course, why should people care? The basic question we ask about most of any research that we do. Then about 10 years ago, actually almost exactly 10 years ago, to mark the centennial of the Wright brothers' flight in 2003, we placed the Flyer in a new exhibition setting with a very thorough telling of its story. A key feature of this setting was the close proximity of visitors to the airplane. Now visitors can get up close to it and see it in great detail. This not only enhanced the so-called wow factor by placing visitors only a few feet away from this icon of ingenuity and change, but now, and this is the critical point that I think we wish to enter into today, is now the Flyer could be used as a teaching tool by our educators and our curators. In its present setting, one can seize the smallest details and use the object to understand its design and grasp why it is such an important and seminal object. It changed how we share the Flyer with our visitors and enhanced learning opportunities in a myriad of ways. Now, by placing the Wright Flyer in the 3D viewer that we're previewing today, we can extend and enhance those learning opportunities well beyond the walls of the National Air and Space Museum. For as you know, this is not simply a 3D computer-generated model of the Flyer. This is a 3D scan of the actual artifact. You are seeing the Wright Flyer, not a representation of it. As a curator whose job it is to interpret and convey information and understanding about the objects in his collection, this null tool provides an exciting capability. We can bring the user to the object in unprecedented ways and stimulate questions and dialogue about it. Nothing can replace the power of standing before the actual artifact, as Oliver Frank's statement about the Flyer being like the original wheel so compellingly suggests. And as I often say about my Wright Flyer, if an inanimate object can have charisma, this is certainly one. When you see people engage this object in the museum, it really is extraordinary how they interact with it. But the 3D program that we have here can affect countless new encounters with the Wright Flyer, for those who have seen it before, as well as for those who are learning about it for the first time. It can supplement and enhance the experience of seeing the real object. It's a powerful tool to advance the Smithsonian mission to help transform the Smithsonian into a current institution serving ever-changing needs and desires of our visitors, both in person and online, as well as to contribute to the role we've always played as the keeper of the nation's heritage through our extraordinary collections. So that's a bit of why and where we got to, and now we're able to extend what we've been doing with our new exhibition at the Wright Flyer with the program here. And we've done 3 tours, and this one takes an opportunity of looking at Vince, help me out here. Okay, looking at the Flyer in detail. And as I mentioned, back in 1984, we actually disassembled the Wright Flyer in its entirety and studied it quite well. And you can see we're able to match the 3D scan here of the Flyer and move it around and analyze it in this way. And then on the right, we can see photographs of it taken apart. So we can unpack the airplane using some old technology and some information that we gather with photographs from when we had that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity when we took the airplane apart, and pairing that with the new way to look at it. We can also talk about the understanding of how the airplane was designed in interesting ways. We can have historical images of instruments that the Wright brothers used. This is a picture of their wind tunnel, and we relate that to the aerodynamic components on the airplane. So you can bring the historical and the interpretive image together quite nicely on the same screen. We can look at some of the details on how the airplane was controlled. On the right, you see the photograph of the airplane today with the pilot's hip cradle where he controls the airplane, and then you can manipulate the scan here, and you can see it from all angles and understand how the components of it connect to the wings and how it operates, and that's, of course, paired with the explanatory text. Here's another aspect of how we can see up close a photograph of the airplane, but then we can take the viewer and get, and I'm not quite sure how we do the zoom, but you can zoom in and get an even more intimate look at how this particular component that controls the elevator works. And again, just kind of going through, you can just kind of unpack the airplane, and you can see it, you can understand the material culture of it, but what I really like about this tool, it allows the curator to then provide some interpretation, provide some questions, so you're interpreting the material culture of it, you're getting to know the object in an intimate way, you can see it in any particular view that you might want, and again, since this is a scan of the actual artifact, okay, I got to learn my skills here a little bit better to get to where I want to go. Don't get dizzy. This is kind of how it would have looked if you were riding in the Flyer in 1903. But again, you can pair the material culture, you can pair the interpretation, and then you can pair that with the access, all in this one convenient package. Here again, we took the airplane apart and inspected every detail of it, and then you can see how those individual components relate to the artifact. Here you have the individual wing ribs that make up the wings, and then you see them here all taken apart and the conservator working on them. The engine of the Wright Flyer. Here we can unpack it and see a little bit about what's inside. When we did the restoration in 1984, we were able to take it all apart and study the internal components of it. We did a lot of analysis of the cast aluminum crankcase and learned a bit about the early casting techniques that were used to create this, which of course became a foundation for aircraft design and the use of aluminum. But again, we can pair seeing the object as it was taken apart and then understanding how it works by using this the 3D viewer. And we can do certain, I don't know, Vince, if you can we do it on this one? You can take certain layers away on this one. I'm not sure if this is the one we do that with. So we can take away certain components and isolate certain aspects of it. Here we've taken away the propulsion system so you can see a little bit more readily some of the design. And in the other two tours where we have the hot spots and the overview tour, it's very helpful to illustrate some of the certain points when you can take away some of the complexity of the object. So, and then again, here's a case where, illustrating what I was just talking about, you can isolate the one component, the landing gear of the Wright Flyer. Of course, it didn't have wheels. It landed on the sand, so it landed on these skids. And you can illustrate some other aspects of it. This little guy here on the front, that's actually a bicycle hub that they used. Obviously, they had a lot of bicycle parts around, and that little bicycle hub is what was used to track the airplane down its launching ramp, so we can analyze certain pieces of it and take the airplane apart in that way. Here again, here we're talking about the pilot's position, and we can isolate those things with the viewer and see them from every particular angle. So it just gives you that added way to unpack the airplane. And what's really exciting about it is we've tried to do this with the display of the actual artifact in the gallery, And even though we have our many millions of visitors that come to the Smithsonian to take advantage of seeing the real artifacts, this is going to be an extraordinary opportunity to be able to take it in all sorts of places. Vince and Adam talked about the classroom, but this is a way where people can communicate about the object across the globe. You can bring students into conversation with curators at the Smithsonian or teachers in other places or in other museums. So it just really broadens the ability to take the artifacts, take the collection outside the walls of the Smithsonian. So that's a little bit of the way we're dealing with the Wright Flyer, and I'll end there and turn it over to one of my other colleagues who will show you some of the other objects we've scanned. Thank you.